While rationality is a powerful tool, its overemphasis can lead to the neglect of other ways of knowing, such as intuition, emotion, and spiritual understanding. This creates an imbalanced worldview that can feel disconnected from the full spectrum of human experience, which someone I know coined solar madness, which can then lead to the creation and adherence to conceptual frameworks that do not reflect the complexities of reality, which can lead to a dissociation from the actual lived experience. And these quote-unquote fantasy frames may simplify or distort reality, providing a false sense of security or understanding, but ultimately leading to disillusionment and alienation. So by dismissing non-rational aspects of life, such as emotions, spirituality, and subjective experiences, modern culture can alienate individuals from important parts of their humanity. And this dismissal can cause individuals to feel incomplete or disconnected from themselves and others. And these rigid structures and unrealistic expectations of modern culture can be traumatizing, particularly for those who do not fit within its narrow definitions of success and value, or the emotional aesthetic norms, for instance. And this trauma can manifest as dissociation, where individuals disconnect from reality as a coping mechanism. So for those who are most affected by the cultural pressures and traumas of solar madness, they may experience even greater levels of disassociation. This can create a cycle where the more one feels disconnected, the more one might retreat into fantasy or other forms of escapism, further perpetuating their sense of alienation. Where modern ideologies often create idealized concepts and frameworks that are detached from the messy, nuanced realities of human life. And these fantasy frames provide a false sense of certainty and control, but fail to address the complexities and unpredictability inherent in reality. We can see this solar madness also in the proliferation of entertainment media, virtual realities, and consumer culture. Modern culture often prioritizes rationality and productivity next to escapism, leading individuals to suppress their emotions. And over time, this suppression can result in emotional numbness or a diminished capacity to experience and process emotions effectively. This emotional suppression can create a disconnect between individuals and their authentic emotional experiences, making it harder for them to engage with reality on a deeper, more meaningful level. So, modern culture is basically a cultural baseline disassociation from reality, an escape into a fantasy world that is not actually real. This then also ties into both the personal and societal complexes as well, this being psychological complexes, and these being organized patterns of emotions, memories, perceptions, and desires that are largely unconscious. And they often develop as a result of unresolved conflicts or traumas. Like Kronos devouring his children out of fear, complexes can suppress or distort natural instincts and impulses, which are often perceived as threatening or disruptive to the ego's sense of control. Which also ties into archetypes, which in Jungian psychology are universal symbols and patterns that shape human experiences and behaviors, and they represent innate predispositions towards certain ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving. And when a psychological complex represses an archetypal impulse, it suppresses the natural expression of these innate patterns, much like how Kronos' action toward the development and expression of his offspring's potential. So just as Kronos' actions lead to the turmoil and eventual conflict with Zeus, The repression of archetypal impulses by complexes can lead to inner conflict, emotional turmoil, and a sense of disconnection from one's authentic self. So the suppressed energies and instincts may manifest indirectly through symptoms, neuroses, or dysfunctional behaviors, which often leads to a reinforcing of the complexes, or also the societal complexes within the culture, when such behaviors surface in particular individuals or groups. Now, when it comes to the individuals that adhere more strictly towards the societal complexes, well, often there's also a pretense of care that masks underlying power dynamics where they impose their will to maintain control. So that ties into the rejection of the feminine, and with it, the current solar madness as well. The kingdom of Kronos. How I would call it from my own mystery school lens. The swallowing of the gods into Kronos. The sacrifice of the inner child for a kingdom ruled by fragmentation, separation, hyper-rationality, devoid of anything subjective, emotional, sentimental, particular. Devoid of what is deeper, meaningful, creates belonging, and a true sense of identity beyond mere externalization of our sense of self. And the way out is really about the process of psycho-spiritual development. That is what is, important, as this is what cultivates the virtues internally. And it is through us working through our own shadows, facing our own suffering, that we, for instance, cultivate compassion towards others. Enforcing a set of principles or virtues onto others by necessity creates shadows and sins. Because humans tend to think in terms of dualities, so the need for compassion might thus push healthy assertiveness, which is falsely seen as aggression, into the shadow, which hinders self-compassion, self-acceptance, and thus also genuine compassion towards others. Which also coincides with the externalization of the Redeemer onto an external figure as well. As Jung says, the spirit of true Christianity is actually becoming oneself into Christ. However, that can be done only by the self-realization of what Christ actually means. That is to say, the Christ or the suffering servant or the Messiah being their own self. Where I might personally add that as much Dionysius Zagreus is such a symbol of the self as well, where Jung further stated that it is no wonder why the Westerner is so prone to devalue himself, since he's placing all that presents goodness and even badness, but overall completeness outside. Even his own salvation depends upon an external figure, for if there's some kind of salvation, it would be more appropriate if it is self-salvation. So in an outward form of religion where all the emphasis is on the outward figure, where we are dealing with a more or less complete projection, the archetype is identical with externalized ideas but remains unconscious as a psychic factor. And when an unconscious content is replaced by a projected image to, that extent, it is cut off from all participation in and influence on the conscious mind. This being a hindrance that could lead to the mind to basically downgrade itself. That is to say, regress to infantile states of mind. Where Jung finally stated that thus Abraxas reigns over the world and is not dominated by anyone, for the world is duality, and Abraxas, or the monad, is the synthesis that solves the contradiction. That is to say, they represent the union of opposites. For in the world, duality is an illusion. That's why good and evil belong to the world, for they are no more than human constructs. That's why thinking in duality leads to error. However, unity belongs to the divine, which is absolute. Now, when it comes to salvation and also the Redeemer figure, well, a good example with this would be Paul Atreides in Dune, where the Fremen could be seen as the archetypal scapegoat living in the desert. As this is archetypally and symbolically the scapegoat experience emotionally, something, I know all too well myself as former scapegoat. And their longing for the renewal of their desert world of Arrakis is the same longing and hope for renewal the inner child within the scapegoat longs for. With it, also acceptance, redemption, and an end to the suffering being sought externally. However, as we can see with Paul, the externalization of the Redeemer onto an external figure does not lead to true liberation, which is where Chani is correct, as the externalization of the Redeemer still keeps up what in Jungian psychology is called the scapegoat complex, which can only truly be overcome through the inner work needed to connect with the inner Redeemer, the Jungian self. Which is why, ironically, the Redeemer, even if they mean well, might unknowingly reinforce the pattern that they hope to free others from. As we can see with the Dune books, this leads to a massive war and with it billions of deaths, which reinforces the societal complexes and the linked cultural trauma, if we would, take this into a more modern cultural context. If such a thing would occur, a civil war or anything of the sort, which over time deepens the cultural shadow, leading through the repression of the shadow to an eventual eruption of such shadow again, hence perpetuating the cycle of light versus shadow, which is also something we can see in Star Wars. It's the very nature of the teachings of the Jedi that ends up creating the Sith. So Jedi fall to the dark side, where the Jedi's response is to fight and exterminate the Sith. However, through their dogma, they don't see how their very teachings create the very conditions that create the Sith in the first place. Something that in Legends, Luke tries to rectify, as it was the love for his father and his father's love for him that led to the outcome and the end of the Sith, which brought balance to the Force, so not the Jedi teachings. So this hyper-rational way of being, which ties into the distorted Apollo archetype, think Jedi, seems to thus be embodying the very thing it projects onto the Dionysian, which in Star Wars is depicted as the Sith. However, the true Dionysian is connected to empathy, cooperation, emotions, intuition, spontaneous behavior, artistic pursuits, communal values, mysticism, the union of opposites, and spiritual practices, next to displays of vulnerability and emotional honesty. Yet the distorted Apollonian portrays it as a weakness, the unknown, unpredictable, chaos, destruction, aggression, selfishness, and lust for power. So the very qualities that the distorted Apollonian fears within itself are projected onto the Dionysian, creating a false dichotomy, which creates a powerful yet deceptive narrative about itself and the Dionysian. The Apollonian persona, which is built around rationality, control, and order, cannot acknowledge these contradictions. The persona's idealized image prevents the recognition that these traits, when distorted, can lead to superficiality and aggression. The Apollonian thus fails to see how its own pursuit of control and individual success mirrors the traits it attributes to the Dionysian. So when rational control becomes excessive and repressive, it invites chaos, as the instincts and emotional responses that are suppressed will eventually erupt or manifest in distorted ways. the inability to see the manifestations of one's own repressed traits lead to self-deception, where the Apollonians' idealized self-image blinds it to the reality that it is in fact embodying some of the very traits it decries in the Dionysian, which creates a cycle of projection and denial. And this distorted Apollonian-Dionysian duality creates a distortion in how humanity sees itself. It becomes a sort of self-deception brought about by this lens of good versus evil, order versus chaos, where the two sides throughout history fighting each other are the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, where both present themselves as champions of different values. The Dionysian often appears as advocates of empathy, social justice, and inclusivity, while the Apollonian emphasizes tradition, order, and authority. However, beneath these surface ideals, both sides can exhibit distorted Apollonian-Dionysian duality traits. And what we are seeing in the culture is different reactions to the same societal and personal complexes, without there being a resolution of them. So the distorted Dionysian side reacts against it in defiance, unaware of these being now in their own shadow, where the distorted Apollonian side embraces and reinforces these societal and personal complexes. And these complexes, often symbolized by titans in Greek myth, represent both hyper-rationality as much as chaos, as it is the hyper-rationality that creates the disconnect from healthy instinct that invites in chaos. As such, hyper-rationality and chaos are both two sides of the same coin, and each embodies traits of the other. And that is how the distorted Dionysian can at the same time lead to ideological rigidity or a suppression of dissent under the guise of protecting marginalized voices, as much as that the distorted Apollonian can become reactive and driven by fear. And if we are to transcend this conflict caused by solar madness that keeps humanity stuck in the kingdom of Kronos, a movement towards the kingdom of Zeus and with it finally to the kingdom of Dionysus has to be made. And it is the process of psycho-spiritual development which helps us overcome these distortions and self-deception. Though for most people this would entail a movement from the kingdom of Kronos to Zeus when going through this process, which would make a slow movement towards anima and animus integration possible. However, further development depends on a willingness to go deeper into things beyond the personal shadow and even the collective shadow of the times we are living in, which is not a path for everyone. So, whilst the distorted Apollonian sees this dichotomy as things such as order versus chaos next to rationality versus irrationality and control versus destruction, the true dichotomy actually is different, which produces out of the two a third that goes beyond the two. So the true dichotomy is as follows. Logic and emotion produces wisdom and emotional intelligence. Discipline and spontaneity produces adaptive mastery, where individualism and communal values produces empowered cooperation. Rationality and mysticism producing enlightened rationality, artistic precision and creative flow producing inspired artistry, vulnerability and strength leading towards resilient authenticity, and finally comfort zone and novelty leading to courageous growth. And the harmonious integration of these dichotomies would thus result in a balanced and enriched existence where people can navigate the complexities of life with both stability and a sense of flexibility, which would thus support continuous personal development, meaningful connections with others, and a deep appreciation for both the material and spiritual aspects of existence. which would then also bring a sense of purpose and fulfillment, as one would be able to draw upon the full spectrum of human experiences and capabilities. We can also see this with the Corybantes as well. The Corybantes, as disciplined warriors and ecstatic dancers, demonstrate the potential for integrating these dichotomies, where their disciplined martial training embodies Apollonian qualities, while their ecstatic dances and rituals express Dionysian energy. And I'm saying this having personally worked through the very things I'm talking about, so having integrated my personal shadow, the collective shadow, and anima animus, next to working through the scapegoat-redeemer split. So this is not just theoretical, but something actionable and immediate in its applicability. We all can transcend such dualities of order and chaos. And it is through this process of bringing the fragments of the soul together that allows the slow birthing of the self.